there are going to be in life many situations in which there's nothing we can do, and there is no action we can take to change the circumstances. Sometimes there are just circumstances that are beyond our control that create a situation for us that's undesirable. Sometimes, we feel hurt about something that someone else is going through, and when we can help someone else, Torah and Judaism are all about helping people whenever we can. But the fact is, and this in and of itself can be a process to learn to accept and to deal with, and it can be very painful when there's someone who we love and desperately want to help, and they don't want to be helped, they're not ready to be helped. Oftentimes there's very little we can do, and sometimes we need to just have the faith and accept that, this is not our battle, this is not our mission. And sometimes then, crying can actually play a couple of roles. Crying can be part of the process of accepting and dealing with the pain that we feel to help ourselves get to a healthier situation with experiencing that and dealing with it. And sometimes crying as a part of prayer, part of the process of prayer, part of the process of teshuvah, of repentance, maybe in the merit of that person that we want to help. Those are additional roles that crying can play. And, don't underestimate the power of prayer and of teshuvah and turning things around ourselves in the merit of someone else who we want to help, but we can't help directly. So crying can have a role to play, a number of different roles to play there. And, sometimes it can be really hard when there's someone we love and we desperately want to help and we can't because they're just not ready to accept help. And when there's someone who we love and are unable to help and they're in a difficult situation and there's nothing we can do about it, that's that's one of the ultimate situations in which crying is the thing to do. We have that pain and there's not much we can do about it. We can cry in prayer, and we can cry in our acknowledgement and validating and processing the pain that we feel to allow ourselves to get to a situation in which we can live with it in a way that's more healthy, in a way that in a situation in which we've processed that and dealt with it and gone through it. But generally, when we have undesirable circumstances that surround ourselves that are to do with us, it's much more likely that there is something we can do about it. When it's someone else, sometimes we can help people, sometimes there's what to do. A lot of times we desperately want to help someone and we can't because they have to be ready to take the responsibility. And we can't make people take responsibility. We can try to open their eyes. We can try to, help them with awareness. We can try to encourage them. But if someone's not ready to take responsibility, there really is a limit to what we can do for them. But when it comes to ourselves, it's our responsibility, and we have to step up to the plate and take responsibility for our circumstances. And it's true that with ourselves too, there can be circumstances that are beyond our control. But largely when it comes to our own circumstances, we're much more likely to be responsible for things to a far greater degree than when we're talking about someone else's circumstances. So when it's our own circumstances, our own situation, generally speaking, it's much more likely that the priority is going to be coming up with a plan of action and taking action to change those circumstances rather than crying about them. As opposed to when it's someone else, it's much more likely that, it's likely that there's going to be much more of a limit on what we can actually do to change things. And it's likely that crying is going to have much more of a place, and much more of a role to play. And this really comes up in a couple of different places in this week's Torah portion. So there are two instances we see in this week's Torah portion of crying, of people crying together. One is when Yosef, so in this week's Torah portion, Vayigash, it's the continuation of the saga when Joseph was the king, the ruler, second to the ruler, second to the king, second to the Pharaoh in Egypt. And his brothers had come down to get food, and they didn't recognize him because he'd been a young child, and now he was this mature adult. And he knew who they were, and he was sort of leading them along and going along in this whole story. And finally, he acknowledges to them who he is, and he tells them who he is. And in this story, when Yosef and Binyamin, Yosef had 10 half-brothers. So there were 12 brothers, all sons of Yosef, but they were born to 4 different mothers. So Yosef was one of the 12. He had 10 half-brothers and 1 full brother from both his father Jacob, and his mother Rachel. And this full brother was Binyamin. And then Yosef and Binyamin embraced and they wept. Both of them were crying. And there's Medrash that explains why the 2 of them were crying. And it says that Yosef was crying for a loss that he foresaw in Binyamin's future, and Binyamin was crying for a loss that he foresaw in Yosef's future. Right? And this is the reason why each one was crying for the other one's loss. When it comes to Yosef's loss in his future, in the future of his tribe, of his descendants, of his domain, his territory, that's his responsibility. And the primary approach of Yosef towards his issues is figure out what to do about it and try to get the job done. It's not to say that crying never has any place, but the primary responsibility, the primary plan of action is step up to the plate, figure out what needs to be done, and make it happen. When it comes to Binyamin's losses in his future, in Binyamin's territory, in Binyamin's domain, there's a lot less control that Yosef has and a lot less responsibility. And that's why when it came to Binyamin's losses in his future, Yosef cried, because there wasn't as much that he could do about it. But what he could do was cry. He could cry to process what he was going through. He could cry to commiserate with Binyamin, and he could cry in prayer. And the same thing was true of Binyamin for Yosef's losses. And that's why they weren't crying for themselves, because when it came to themselves, each one knew that they had to take responsibility and get the job done. When it came to each other's losses, the losses that they foresaw in each other's future, then they cried. And we have a similar story that happened with Yosef and his father Yaakov. When Yosef acknowledged to his brothers, admitted who he was, and told them, like, it's me, Yosef, your brother. And he tells them, go get our father Yaakov, bring him down to Egypt. I got you, I'm going to take care of him. Tell him to come ASAP. I haven't seen him for years. He needs to come here, live here. It's going to be all good. So they, go back and get Yaakov and bring Yaakov down to Egypt. And when Yosef meets Yaakov, it says that Yosef, in his embrace of Yaakov, Yosef wept. Yaakov didn't weep. Yaakov was saying Shema. He was saying Shema Yisroel, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And again, the reason is the same. Why did Yosef weep? Yosef wept because of the losses he foresaw, the same losses he foresaw before. That it was a loss for the entire Jewish people, but primarily associated with Binyamin and Binyamin's responsibility. And there wasn't that much that Yosef could do about it. So he cried. And it's talking about the destruction of the Batei Mikdash, the destruction of the temples that were in Binyamin's region of Israel, of Eretz Yisrael. And so Yosef saw the loss, the destruction of the temples in Binyamin's region of Eretz Yisrael, and he cried because it wasn't his territory. There wasn't as much that he could do. It wasn't so much his responsibility. But Yaakov was the father of all the tribes, right? We are called the people of Israel, Bnei Yisrael, the sons of Israel. Who's Yisrael? Yisrael is Yaakov's second name. He is the father of all 12 tribes. He's the father of the entire Jewish people. So Yaakov wasn't crying about it. Yaakov was busy doing what he could do. Yaakov was affirming his faith in the Creator, affirming the oneness of God. And more specifically, again, there are midrashim that talk about the connection between Shema, between the Shema prayer and sacrifices, and say that the Shema is to a degree a replacement and equivalent of the sacrifices that were offered in the temple. So Yaakov foresaw the destruction of the temples, and he didn't have time to cry about it. This is his turf. This is his territory. This is his responsibility. So what did he do? He said Shema, which is the equivalent of the service that was carried out in the temples. But for Yosef, it was outside of his territory and domain. It was outside of his responsibility. So he cried, because that's what he could do. It's what he could do to alleviate his own pain and hurt. And it's what he could do to commiserate and perhaps to pray on behalf of what was going to happen in Binyamin's territory. So, and it's not always either or. A lot of times, we can experience and acknowledge and validate what we're going through, and it might involve some crying, and then take action. And sometimes validating the pain we're going through and maybe crying about it if necessary can be an important part of what we have to go through in order to be ready to take the actions we need to take. But when there are actions that we can take, that's the primary approach. The primary focus is take the actions, come up with a strategy, and get it done. And in a situation where it's not our responsibility and there isn't much that we can do, then the role of crying is really going to be very much more at the forefront. Now, and this is a really, really profound and very important lesson that we can take from both of these stories in this week's parsha, from both of these encounters between Yosef and his brother Binyamin, and between Yosef and his father Yaakov. There's a time to cry, and when it's the time to cry, it's the right thing to do. But there's also a time to take action, and when it's time to take action, crying makes things worse than they need to be, because we could be alleviating the negative circumstances and eliminating them instead of just reducing the pain that we experience as a result. And to cry to reduce the pain we experience as a result of undesirable circumstances, when we could be eliminating the negative circumstances and making them better so that we don't even have negative emotions that we have to alleviate, it's a real shame to just focus on alleviating and reducing the pain and suffering. It's a shame. If you haven't yet, click on the subscribe button, then click on the notification bell to see future videos. And please, again, share the link wherever you share things on social media, Facebook, wherever it is, WhatsApp groups, WhatsApp status, to help this message reach more people. This has been the Bites of Judaism podcast. This podcast has been made possible by Mr. and Mrs. David and Malki Smetana. If you found it valuable, please leave a 5-star rating and a review. It really does help it reach more people. And tell your friends about it. If you haven't yet, you can subscribe on all the major podcast platforms at rabbiglick.link/podcast. To dedicate a future episode of the podcast, send an email to podcast@rabbiglick.com. See you next time.